morning, everybody. We are here at Condon Yards in High Point, North Carolina, at the Charter School Marketplace office. And that was a shitty introduction, so that's going to cut that. So, good morning, everybody. We are here in High Point, North Carolina, at the 7 Degrees of Change Charter School Marketplace studio. And I have the privilege of introducing Steve Hubrich today, who owns Hubruch Construction. Is it Hubrich?
Hubrich.
Hubrich, so that's the correct pronunciation. So Steve is a longtime player in the charter school space. I'll let him talk about how many buildings he's developed and what he's done and his scope of work. But first of all, Steve, if you could kind of tell us about your family and a little bit about yourself personally.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Again, my name is Steve Hubrich. I'm the owner of Hubruch Constructing in Durham, North Carolina. I've got my wife, Tina. I've got 3 wonderful children, Ethan, who's graduating NC State this summer, Scarlett Jane, who will be an upcoming senior, and then my youngest daughter, Juliet, who's 15 and goes to Discovery Charter School in Durham.
So you believe in it enough to have your own child in a charter school?
Yes, sir. My son Ethan went to the first charter school that we developed and constructed, which was Voyager Academy in Durham. My middle daughter, Scarlett Jane, was also in Voyager for a period of time, but she's got some dyslexia issues, so we chose to do some homeschooling with her, and she also goes to the Hill Center in Durham. And then Juliet is in another charter school that we developed about 3 or 4 years ago, Discovery Charter School. So
did you get into charter schools because your children were in them, or which was first?
No, yeah, it's like charter schools first. I didn't even know what a charter school was. We were developers and contractors for medical office properties, lab space, warehouse space. And we had a charter school walk into our office and wanted to know if we could convert a warehouse into a charter school space in approximately 90 days. And it was Voyager Academy, which at the time I didn't even know what a charter school was. And we were able to.
What year was this?
It was around 2004, 2004.
So you've been in it for
about 15, 16 years.
So you've been in the game for a while, then. So how many charter schools have you worked on at this time?
We've done about 42 charter schools. At the end of this year, we'll have 42 charter schools developed and constructed.
That's cool. It's 42 out of how many are there? 200. So that's a pretty substantial number.
Currently we're licensed in Florida, North Carolina.
So that's total.
That's total.
I'm sorry.
So it's North and South Carolina. In North Carolina, it's probably 15 to 20.
So that's still a substantial number. 20 schools. That's 10%.
Yeah.
Of the schools. So that's impressive. So tell us a bit about what your company does, kind of from soup to nuts.
So what we do is we work with the schools. We try to identify their business plan, what their enrollment is, what their budget's going to be, and how we can help advocate to put that school into their own property. Sometimes it's renovating an existing facility. Sometimes it's buying a piece of property, putting them into modulars, and then expanding into a permanent facility. But what we found is the schools that we're able to get into a school building really drives enrollment. Parents see that this is going to be a real school.
Build it and they shall come.
The first school that we did, when I need to go back and correct my math, because I said it was about 2005. So that would be almost, it wasn't 2005. It was more like 2008, I believe that was. So that would be around 15 years ago, but not 2005. So I just want to correct my math. I'm pretty good at math typically. But when we put them into that warehouse building, we kind of, myself and the previous owner of our company looked at it and said, this doesn't feel like a school. It looks like a warehouse. It looks like we threw a bunch of walls up into a warehouse. There wasn't a lot of exterior windows. So that's when we started analyzing and saying, well, what if we move you onto this piece of property and build a school? And when we did that, I think Durham Academy, or Voyager Academy in Durham right now has 3,000 kids on the waiting list. And it started out as a middle school. And then once those middle schoolers moved up to high school age, they came back to us and said, is there any way we can build a high school? And then once we built the high school, then they came back and said, can we build the elementary school? So it really became this project that went, over a 5-year period, went from just a middle school renovating a warehouse into a real middle school that parents saw with a gymnasium, athletic field, and then the high school, and then the elementary school. So now it's 1,300 kids with close to 3,000 kids on the way.
So it's not just sticks and bricks. It's, you can look at a budget and understand.
Yes.
What's the threshold? How many kids do you have to meet your budget? It's not, throw me a set of specs and I'll give you a price on sticks and bricks.
Right. And I think what we do that differentiates us from a lot of others is that we're a general contractor.
Mm-hmm.
So we build these facilities so we know what the cost of construction is. So that helps us when we're sitting down with a school, but it also with our lengthy time frame and how many projects we've done, we actually know that you tell me how many students are going to be in that building, and I'll say that building needs to be 40,000 square feet, based on our program plan, based on our knowledge, based on what the school can afford. So it's all part of the model. We try to reverse engineer. We start out with the student population. We identify approximately how big that school should be within 2,000 square feet. And then we sit down with the school and we actually map out the amount of classrooms that are required to make their school function. And then we give a budget. So we really kind of start at the top and say, what is it from your budget perspective? And then we kind of help guide them through that process.
And that's all baked into the cake. That's not, that's an extra consulting fee.
No, that's all part of what we do. Like I do that for schools all the time. We're just looking at it and saying, well, this should be a 45,000 square foot building. This is based on 450 kids or 475 kids. We usually are averaging somewhere between 90 and 100 per child when you include a gymnasium. And we think that a lot of schools need to include a gymnasium. It's very important.
Yes.
Over the past couple of years, cost of construction has gotten extremely expensive. So that's the first thing that goes, but we try to design it where you can at least add that gymnasium within 1 or 2 years.
I remember the days of $100 a foot.
Yeah. When we first started this out, total project with site work and everything, we would bid around $150 a foot with site work. Now, everything we're doing is $275 to $300. And we just recently priced one in New Bern that was $285 a foot. One in Reedsville, $282
And
a
that's
foot.
land.
That doesn't include the cost of the land.
That's
It's just
I meant the
site work, infrastructure, and construction. No furniture, fixtures, or equipment. So we're building projects where it's just like building your home. We build it. It's got all the infrastructure, IT, wiring, security, and then you bring your furniture in and start.
Do you know what the FF&E budget numbers are?
Well,
Now?
most schools are plugging in 250 to 500,000, and it's really all over the board because we've worked with charter schools that have been very efficient and have hit the phones and called all the school districts in the area, Duke University, UNC.
That's how we started.
And they find furniture for next to nothing.
That's
and
what we
then
did. We had all salvage when we started.
Yeah. And then you get other schools that are saying, hey, we want all this new modern stuff that we saw at the conference that has green colors and light blue colors. So it just depends on the school we're working with. Yeah, it's all about the money. Like if they've got 250,000, a lot of times they'll get FF&E added to their bond and say, hey, we've got a budget of 300,000. Let's go get furniture.
So you brought up a good point. Adding the FF&E to the bond. Explain, if you would, how you work with, first of all, well, we'll start with bonds and then we'll move to banks. So, or do you want to start with banks and then bonds? So kind of the process of how do you get bank financing and investor financing, and then kind of the second piece of that, because you can't generally, you can't really go straight into a bond with new construction. generally.
generally.
So but that would kind of be the second phase for most people. So if you could kind of talk about phase one, so you talked about the planning stages, really working with the school, fleshing it out, how they're going to get the numbers and what the site should be. So the next piece is if you talk about the investor financing or bank financing, and then the bonds, and then later we'll talk about planning and zoning and the other
Sure.
issues.
So for us, when we're working with a school, and let's just say it's a startup school, they don't have the resources to go out and hire architects, engineers. They don't have the resources to put equity into a project to get a bank loan. And they haven't even opened for one day of school. So there's no guarantee that those students are going to. So in today's environment, the schools that are getting financing, and that includes bank financing, need to have a management team that's got some knowledge of the charter school space. That they've opened up a charter school before. We work with a couple different banks, and Hubrich will come to the bank. We will put the 25% equity in, take out a construction loan, personally guarantee that construction loan to build that building.
Does anybody else do that?
Yeah, there's some developers out there that are doing that. National developers that are also doing that. Nobody in North Carolina, but we are the only one in North Carolina that does it. And the other thing too is we need to look at that school. If it's a school that's starting out with 150, 200 kids, then I'm not going to be able to get the financing. So it's got to be something that's financeable. So that's usually some schools that start out, 250, 300, and they're growing to 600 that in a 2 or 3 year period, and then we'll introduce them to the bond market. So when we're talking or meeting with schools, one of the first things we do is say, have you looked for any churches? Churches are an ideal place for charter schools to get off the ground because the classrooms are already there. And a lot of these churches aren't using those classrooms during the week, only use them during the weekends or maybe on a Wednesday night. And if they could possibly go into those spaces and then improve those spaces for the church obviously benefits, the school benefits with hopefully a lower lease rate. Then the other option would be to find a piece of property that you want to put the permanent building on. Design it in such a way so you can do enough infrastructure to provide safe on-site circulation for car traffic, parking, and then maybe getting them started in a modular classroom setup from Will Scott, Mobile Modular.
Because that's actually, we did that in 1997. We started in the little church, then went to the modulars, then built the buildings.
Yes. And then at that point, you've shown the banks, hey, this school said they were going to open with 300. We proved it. They proved it. It's 300. So after that first year, you get schools into either modulars or a church for 1 year. Then I can go to the bank and say, here's the school. Here's their management team. We opened up this past August. They were anticipated 300. We have 300 and they got 300 on the wait list. So that right there will allow me to go to 3 or 4 of the banks that we work with and get financing. Now also there's some bond financiers out there where it's a direct placement bond with, say, a Hamlin Capital or someone like that, where they're going to buy all the bonds. So they're basically the direct finance source. Versus if you get 3 years worth of audited financial statements, you can go to the bond market, like the open market.
So that's kind of the phase 2, really. So you get through the phases, you're operational, you've got 3 years of financials. Then you really can start entertaining going to the bond.
Yeah, and when I say going to the bond market, if you've got 3 years worth of audit financials, there's no reason to go directly to one of the finance sources that will do a direct placement and buy all the bonds when you could go to the market and have multiple buyers or investors of those bonds. When you have that opportunity, then you typically, your interest rates are lower, as long as the 3 years worth of audited financial statements show that the school's being financially, fiscally responsible. They've got a certain amount of cash on hand, which is usually 90 to 120 days. And then that the school also is performing. I mean, you can get 3 years worth of audited financial statements show that you've got some cash on hand, but be a horrible performing charter school, and you're really not going to have the type of investors that are going to want to invest in that school.
Well, the big word that, is accountability.
Correct.
So when people say that charter schools are not accountable, you just described a number of things that they're accountable for that nobody else is accountable for. So those are the things that charter schools are accountable for that most people don't know or understand unless you run one. And even a lot of people in charter schools don't understand that because they don't deal with the financials. They don't deal with the regulatory pressures. They don't deal with the compliance issues.
Right.
So there are a lot of moving parts. So we talked about, used to be $100 to $150 a foot. Now it's $300 a foot. Now interest rates a few years ago, you could get 3-4%. So
Yeah.
What are the interest rates now with banks and bond companies?
So there used to be a lending rate called LIBOR.
Mhm.
LIBOR is no longer the indices that the banks lend off of. Now it's SOFR. We used to typically borrow off of LIBOR and now SOFR,
Mhm.
and it's a spread based off.
Can you do you know what the acronym? Can you spell out?
I don't.
Excuse me.
Not on the spot. We've talked about it before.
I'll
but
look that up. Keep talking.
Yeah. So, but right now, SOFR is the lending rate, and so I think last week SOFR was 5.3%. The banks are lending anywhere from 250 to 350 basis points spread over SOFR. That's their lending rate versus what they're borrowing the money to put on. So, for instance.
Sorry, secured overnight financing rate.
Yes. Okay.
SOFR, SOFR.
And so what we do, we borrow that and it's a floating rate. It's not a fixed rate for construction purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2 years ago, or maybe even 18 months ago, we were borrowing SOFR was probably 1% or 1.5%.
Because it's the overnight rate.
Yeah. So like 1.5% and 300 basis points, it's a 4.5% rate.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're borrowing at 8.5%. And so clearly the rent for schools or the lease for schools is going to go up because we've tried to pinch it as far as we can, but now we're, leasing rates are 9 to 10% of whatever project costs are, because you've got to get your spread to turn around and give your investors their return.
Right, because they're not getting the money for free.
Correct. And with all the interest rates have risen so high, investors' money putting into these projects for equity, they're expecting a higher interest rate as well. So that's where it gets squeezed. So
when you've got CDs at 5%, there's federal guaranteed.
Right. That's right.
There's risk
So-
involved, you've got to pay more.
That's right. And 2 years ago, CDs were like 2%. So
I'm glad they're at 5.
yeah. So, but yeah. So the interest rate, banking has increased as well as construction, and I say 275 to 300 right now for cost of construction. But we just finished a project in Huntersville that was bid roughly 18 months ago, and we were $230 a foot.
And that doesn't include land cost.
Correct. But just that right there kind of shows you 230 versus 280, 290.
That's dramatic.
That's $60-70 a square foot in an 18-month period.
That's 25% roughly increase. So we used to figure, 14% was the operating cost.
Mm-hmm.
Your rent, that should kind of be your cap for
Mhm.
what your facilities costs are. I mean, at those numbers now, even though top line funding has increased dramatically over the last several years, I mean, what does that do to your operating percentage, your cost of facilities?
Yeah, so what we see with these schools is the first couple of years, obviously, when you've got lower student population, we see a lot of these schools in and around 20% of revenue in the first couple of years. But the 14-15% is what all the financial advisors say, what you should target your long-term fixed rate.
You've got to have a
debt.
pretty hefty ABM to be with those numbers,
Right.
to be down at 14%.
Because what happens is once you set your bond,
Mhm.
and if you try to target that 14, 15, you might end up being 16, 17 when you actually close those bonds.
Right.
But in a year, you get another 100 kids of revenue. The following year, your ADM goes up
Right.
5%. 5 year, this is fixed debt, just
Right.
like your house. So if you got your fixed debt 10 years down the road, it might be a 12.
Well, the way we negotiated, it was interest free the first 36 months. So
Yeah.
it was strictly principal, no interest. Then the interest rolled in,
Mhm.
and then it leveled out. So the next 25 years, it's flat rate.
Right.
So as your revenue increases, that stays flat.
Correct. And
But
so
then-
that's an inverted curve. So instead of it going up, it's starting to go down.
But then
So-
you've got the maintenance, because as the building
Correct.
gets older, you've got to come in and you've got to do maintenance and upfit.
And that's why we always tell schools that they should have a reserve fund, put money aside, because if
Do you have a
you,
percentage amount, or we always used to say like 250,000, but as a percentage of operating, what do you think?
yeah, just like maybe 1%, 2%, it really depends on the age of the facility. But the long term is going to be your, infrastructure, your asphalt,
Parking
parking,
lots.
but just your air conditioning equipment. The charter schools don't have the ability to pay for the type of equipment that public schools do, which are chiller systems and cooling
And
towers.
those have got
And those are
incredibly expensive.
$50, $60, $70 a square
And the
foot
supply chain on those, you're waiting for a year and a half to get them.
versus charter schools, which are typically doing rooftop units, gas packs. That system is in the $20 to $22 a square foot.
Right.
But those things have warranties for usually 5 to 7 years on the compressors. But after that 7th year, most rooftop equipment is at the end of its useful life around 15. So at 15 years, you need to pull the rooftops, put new ones on. 15 to 20. I mean, we've seen schools that go 20 because we come in and have to do that, renovate.
Well, bathrooms also need to be outfitted
yeah,
in a few years because they get destroyed.
So if you are setting aside money every single year, by the time you need to do that 10 years, 12 years, 15 years down the road, hopefully you've got a couple $1 million to kind of do stuff as you go. Every 15, 20 years, your rooftops need to be redone. Windows should be good, but you should check your waterproofing and caulking and things like that.
So
But a lot of it's flooring, things like that, just to refresh everything. I mean, you need new carpet. Obviously, carpet's not going to last 15, 20 years. So you can have someone come in during the summer, refresh the flooring, things like that.
another huge issue, every municipality has its own set of rules.
Mhm.
We had a regime years ago that was not very friendly.
Mhm.
They held up giving the CO to a new building that we had because they needed custom signage had to be installed. Well, the sign that was taking the longest that we didn't get a CO on was the electrical closet signage in Braille.
Yeah.
So generally, you have a sight impaired person going to the electrical closet in the event of emergency. So that was just punitive, no other word for it. So you deal with, it's not just counties, you've got cities. So there are hundreds of different, fire departments, different sign-offs. How do you deal with each of the different players in each municipality for the litany of things that you have to get signed off from the fire marshal to get your CO to the telecom, everything? How does that work?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, I tell everybody that that's like one of the hardest parts of our in a project is the interface with the local jurisdiction, from permitting, which seems to be getting longer and longer, with more red tape having to be completed every time you do a project. You've got to do a traffic impact study for every single school that goes to the state. statutorily, they have 60 days to respond. Sometimes they respond and the letter is like, that they give you is the data supplied is insufficient for us to complete the review. Give us this, and this. And then you turn that around in a week. Well, that just bought them another week.
Right.
So they don't get, sometimes they're very fast. It really just depends on where
Well, the
they're.
municipality we're in now, like Hyde Park got very good. We had a
Yeah.
Very good city manager. Things were going around quickly, but that was kind of an anomaly because we had a fantastic city manager. So things went like that.
And we're working across different states. So like South Carolina's got what they call the Office of School Facilities.
Mhm.
And that they've got like an on-site portal, all schools have to submit through that. And it's just a disaster. Like it's hard. It'll take you 3 months just to get through the portal to where they can like set up a meeting to come out and look at a site and tell you that this is an acceptable site for a school. Because you got to do all these preliminary.
Sounds like the legislation needs to be done in South Carolina.
Yeah. So that and the whole introduction of the portal system, it just seems like they've got a lot of bugs to work out, and that's just not functioning. Here in North Carolina, you got to work with each individual district, each individual county or city, municipality. So in this past summer, we had issues with elevators being delivered due to parts and pieces from China. Not being able to complete the elevators because the control panels, et cetera, weren't able to be shipped to the job because all the parts weren't there. And so we had jurisdictions, and we actually talked to the state, the lady in charge of ADA requirements, and the state leaves it up. So Department of Labor will leave it up to the local authorities. So the local authorities all have a lot of power. And that's how it's written in the code. It's like up to the local jurisdiction.
I had several conversations going, and they were surprised back in the old days when somebody would actually find out where their cube was in the building and go sit in their office with the plans and say, show me how this works. Because sometimes it just takes, you got to go into the bowels of the building and find the person that's holding things up.
Yeah. And so I personally talked to the head of building inspections in multiple counties this past summer, because what we had was 2 or 3 buildings that were 2-story buildings. All of them had elevators. In 3 of the jurisdictions, we were able to get a letter drafted that the school would accommodate all ADA accessible requirements on the first floor. So all teachers, all students, everybody that needed to be on the first floor could be on the first floor. The one county that we were working with, that the authority said, well, that's not the way we interpret it. So you can occupy the building, but you can only occupy the first floor. So then the second floor was completely 10 classrooms approximately, with no ability to bring students in. And so they had kids sitting, trying to have class in the gymnasium next door for over a 3-4 week period while we're waiting on parts from China to get the elevator installed. And then it just so happens we've installed it. It's the week of the state fair. And then the Department of Labor tells you that they don't have an inspector available for 2 weeks because they're inspecting the rides at the state fair and everybody's in Raleigh. So, and we're like, well, we got a jurisdiction here that's not allowing the school to occupy the second floor. And we're just like, well, that's, hopefully they're like, well, we would hope that they would be able to work with you. And I was like, in their opinion, they think they are working with us by letting us occupy the first floor. They're saying no occupancy on the second floor. And they said, well, we can make a phone call, but that's clearly up to the.
You're trying to apply logic, so we'll just forget about that. So
but those are the challenges that you have in jurisdictions.
So if you take into consideration the barriers to entry with the cost and helping people get set up and figure out what they're going to do. So once you get the money figured out and they've got a school figured out, when you take supply chain issues, you take planning and zoning issues, you take, basic labor, I'm sure is not easy, and subs are difficult these days. So start to finish, realistically, what is the timeline? Because you have to do all the shop drawings, you have to do all the engineering, you have to do all the site engineering. What's the timeline if somebody wants to say, I want to build a school, do you say, give it 2 years, give it 18 months?
18 to 20 months. Because, for instance, the jurisdiction that where we're from, Durham, North Carolina, that takes about 1 year to get through the site plan process. And you also, with schools, you got to do a minor special use permit, which they just changed the ordinance to no longer provide schools in residential zoning. So now you actually have to go through a rezoning for any school in Durham County. They just rewrote that law as of January. So, and what they did was they marked out all residential rural areas, which we used to do a minor special use permit. It was allowed by right.
Right.
Now they've forced all the schools to purchase land. It's only permitted now in office and institutional,
So
commercial,
it sounds like they don't
neighborhood.
want any schools built in the county
charter schools.
or private schools.
Well, or public schools. The difference is public schools can write a $10 million check.
And
Because
they-
now they've said, you're gonna go on the land that is the most expensive land to purchase. Because residential developers that I know, they want schools in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But now you're gonna have to go through rezoning, which is no longer a quasi judicial hearing. And it's now just a political zoning.
So they've essentially legalized not putting schools up.
Correct. I mean, that's the way I see it.
It's-
I mean, that's the way I see it, because now,
There's no other way to see it.
well, it's kind of funny because last year, we were trying to get 2 charter schools on a piece of property in Hillsborough. And in Orange County, that is their ordinance. You got to go through a rezoning for a school. We lost 0-9 at Orange County commissioners with planning staff approval, DOT approval, Orange
There's no
County.
politics in charter schools. Come on.
But then, once we removed the charter school piece, because we lost,
Mhm.
and and it was a master plan with 8 baseball fields for HYAA,
Mhm.
tennis and pickleball courts for
Mhm.
Orange County tennis community, and then the charter schools. Once we removed the charter schools, we went to the Board of Adjustment, and it was a unanimous 6-0 vote.
Sure.
So when you go to a Board of Adjustments, it's a quasi judicial hearing, which means you got to prove findings of fact. And if you prove that you're mitigating traffic, if you're not affecting the values of the property around you,
Mhm.
if it's in harmony with the community, all of those issues, and you're presenting testimony through engineers, traffic engineers, appraisers,
Mhm.
then you should be issued the minor special use permit. Well, now that with its zoning, if they have 100 neighbors come out and say, well, I don't think the traffic is being mitigated, I don't think that my property values are going to be the same, then the people on the board no longer are bound by the findings of fact. And if they can persuade those members, then they can just deny the rezoning.
That sounds consistent. Facts kind of don't matter.
Yeah.
So I think we could probably have another 3 hours of discussions about
Yeah,
this.
for sure.
But that was thank you for your time.
Yeah.
It's a good start. I think we got a lot on the table for
Yeah.
people to chew on.
Yeah, no problem. I'd love to come back and participate again.
Thank you. Well, thank you for what you do for the industry and for our schools.
Yeah, thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
So everybody, thank you for your time today, and hope you have a wonderful evening or afternoon or whenever you watch this podcast. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.